Good morning, everyone. It's still a little bit before 10, so we're going to get started maybe a few minutes after, just to make sure that everybody that wants to join joins.
Good morning. How exciting.
Morning, Jeff. So I'm going to give people maybe a few more minutes to join. Probably like 10:05. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure others will trickle in. We had a substantial amount of people that registered, so I'm hoping that they're just running a little behind. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the second of 5 ICHC Now is the Time Transformation Towards Equity Town Hall series. My name is Cecilia Gomez Reyes, and I will be facilitating today's town hall on education. Frank Nazari will be helping with the Zoom features, and Alicia Martinez Vargas will be monitoring the chat box. We hope that these town halls serve as a platform of engagement in addressing the global health pandemic and social justice issues relative to systemic inequities found across health, education, mental health and substance use, criminal justice system, housing, and the housing system. On our agenda, we will have Dr. Jennifer Kotke, Homeless Education Coordinator at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, also known as LACO. Jose Smith, Senior Program Specialist in Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and Mrs. Lisa Michelle Dabbs, Clerk at the East Whittier City School District Board of Education. We will also have an interacting polling activity and closing remarks and announcements. In recognizing the level of stress and harm experienced by our communities, which may have been enhanced by the difficulties addressing these topics, we ask that you be mindful of the following: safety first, difficult topics, self-care, sincerity and compassion, respect and patience, and positive regard, and our Zoom features, of course. Thank you for your presence, and as we hope to hold a discussion centered around equity at local, community, systemic, and global level. Celebrate successes and lessons learned, educate one another, create a safe virtual space, offer solutions, and promote movement towards resolution and accountability. First, we will welcome Jennifer Kotke. Jennifer Kotke serves as the Homeless Education Coordinator at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, also known as LACO, with over 300 charter schools, 80 districts under her jurisdiction. Her primary focus is approximately 7,000 identified students experiencing homelessness, academic resources designed to serve and support them in previous capacities. She's taught as classroom educator in underserved communities, upheld implementation of the McKinney-Vento Act for homeless children, and youth, served as a homeless education administrator for her district, and coordinated services for foster youth as recent as 2019. Dr. Kotke holds a doctorate of education degree in educational leadership from Azusa Pacific University, APU. Subsequent to that, she earned an MS in educational leadership and administrative credentials from the California State University, Fullerton, as well as a master's in arts in educational counseling and pupil personnel credential, PPS, from APU. Please help join me in welcoming Jennifer Kotke.
Good morning. Can I go ahead and share my PowerPoint?
Yes, please.
Okay. And then do I have sharing right?
Yes,
You should.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm so thankful for you having me this morning. Can you hear me well? Is the sound
Yes,
okay?
perfect. Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
So I do want to thank you for having me. My focus today is really to walk through education and to look at the systematic racial equity issues in education. In addition, I'll add on a specific layer from the lens of students experiencing homelessness. And then I know my colleague, Jose Smith, who I have worked with closely in the past, will continue the presentation using a lens of foster care. And so just looking at our objectives today, I'll be walking through a very brief and limited history of educational history tied to the past up to the present, specifically really focused on educational equity related issues. And then following this, I'll provide some information about the complexities that have arise from being a homeless student and the equity issues that are compounded due to a population that is predominantly comprised of students of color who are struggling to obtain basic needs, which includes education. So we'll wrap it up with some thoughts on things we can do to challenge the current structures and to really keep the dialogue open to discuss critical and difficult subjects, really with the intent of breaking down racial injustice and seeking equity. So just a couple acknowledgements, which I just really want to make sure that I am laying out there. I would ask that we keep a bit of information in mind. And so this is really a broad brush presentation. There will be a lot of stuff I won't cover. So because education has such a lot in it, there's a massive information to go over. I also want to consider the thought that there are many layers to systematic racism. And so we'll only barely dig into one of the many layers. There are many layers where this conversation comes from. And so, but I do want to be clear that we didn't get to this place by accident, and that these layers are largely intentional and have been placed in purpose and intentionality to create historical disadvantages for students of color. And we need to acknowledge that intentionality and the devastating practices it has on students in particular. Additionally, I want to acknowledge that I am a white woman and the privileges that really do come with that orientation. I sit in a place of learning and I'm seeking to grow and understand where my role is when it comes to intentionally being part of breaking down the system that has built up racial inequities. And lastly, one of the things I'm really always super hyper aware of and really want to remind us as people is that these are really difficult and uncomfortable conversations, and that we allow ourselves to process. And I would encourage you to make sure to really pay attention to your body and to take care of yourself through the reflection process. So some of the things I talk about may bring up issues of trauma, and I really would encourage you to practice self-care techniques, and that way to help you really return yourself to the balance. So during the presentation, if you have questions, you're welcome to stop me. But when I get into the historical context, I'm kind of going to ask you to buckle up your seatbelt because there is a lot here that I kind of want to unpack so that you can get the best out of this information. So, but at this point in time, before I move forward, is there any immediate questions that anybody has? And I'm going to take
Actually,
this
Dr.
Go
Cox,
ahead.
if you don't mind, on the bottom right, if you would press the little icon, that way we could see the full screen and perhaps the view quality might be better. On the bottom where you have the bar and positive and negative signs,
Okay.
the symbol right next to the negative sign looks like a little poster with a stick under it. Best description. On the bottom of your screen where you have negative to positive percentage.
Negative. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I can see it.
That first one.
Is that helpful?
Actually, no. I meant the little tab, one icon over. Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Does that help? There?
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. I know my eyeballs are waning too, so sorry about that. So just anything else? Good. We're good. Okay. I'm just going to kind of move into this. So these are packed slides. So I am doing exactly what I always tell people not to do and put lots on slides. So I apologize in advance. So the foundation of education actually started in the late 1700s and 1800s, predominantly for white children. And so funny enough, free public education was largely put into place to civilize the poor and create a docile work environment, a workforce. So there was this attempt to try to create good employees by starting early when they were young children. So the foundations of education, again, started with predominantly white children. And in 1865, we see Abraham Lincoln signs the 13th Amendment, which freed the African-American slaves. Most of the slaves up until that point in time had no education, very limited. And if they did seek out education, oftentimes it was at their own potential for being seeking repercussions. So they oftentimes were beat if it was found that they had been reading or learning how to read. And so there was a lot of nervousness about actually being educated. So at the time that the slaves were freed, the literacy rate was extremely low. And continued to be very low for many years after that. By 1870, we see what we call public education as a commonplace, but it wasn't universal. And when we say commonplace, it means that a lot of children, a lot of times white children, were receiving some type of education, but it differed from town to town, from city to city. And obviously education was still extremely segregated and had been segregated to that point and remained to be segregated. And then in May of 1896, we see laws go into place where the courts created what we call underneath Plessy and Ferguson, which is upholding the Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, and that included school segregation. So basically we created a national agenda and justified school segregation at that time. And then prior to 1954, one of the things I do want to point out is that we had an awful World War I, World War II, right in that time period. And one of the things that occurred and created a lot of problems was, in particular, internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. There was a high racial increase, in particular on racial injustice for Japanese American. They were uprooted from their home and they were forcibly placed into government camps. And this included about 17,000 children. And within those camps, education still occurred. There's many pictures of teachers still teaching students, but obviously with a lack of equity and resources that they would need. But they knew that the population, the Japanese Americans knew that they needed to continue to educate their population to keep them moving forward as far as their academics were concerned. So Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, we see that at this point in time, we have the school board unanimously agreed that segregated schools were inherently unequal. A lot of this had to do with just really blatant funding streams were very limited for Black schools. And so we see a lot of inequities in education. We see a lot of inequities in outcomes, and a lot of inequities on graduation, and very little when it comes to higher education. So, but despite Brown versus education, just like with the 13th Amendment, and we see this historically throughout American history, especially in education, is that a law will be passed and it will take so long for the implications of that law to actually go into place. And so we see even 3 years after this in Arkansas that we have the Little Rock Nine, who were our very brave 9 students who were escorted under high racial tensions onto an all-white campus. And so 3 years later, and we're still dealing with segregation that had been by Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, was supposed to have ended, and then also to work on this desegregating, which obviously wasn't happening, and Arkansas pushed back by actually their established community actually pushed back and said, no, we weren't going to. And so therefore we have this incident that occurs that was very, very public, and really pushed on racial inequity related issues. In 1964, we see the Civil Rights Act, which comes into place, which goes further in an attempt to prohibit discrimination, which includes integration of schools. And in April 1965, we see something that's really pivotal to education, which is something called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This act was what I call an umbrella act. And as new administration comes in, they will generally take this act and they will take it and they will add things to it or take things away, and it will reauthorize over a period of time. And so you can see that it was originally put in place under Lyndon Johnson with the intent of a war on poverty. It set in place what we call Title I protections, which includes eventually McKinney-Vento ends up underneath Title I, which is McKinney-Vento's homeless student population. And the other piece of this is it did set up bilingual education. So it was reauthorized in a lot of different forms in '94. And in 2001, the Bush administration reauthorized it under what we call No Child Left Behind, or sometimes as we refer to in education as Nickelby. And so this particular, became a very high stakes agenda underneath the Bush administration. And this particular revision or reauthorization lasted for a very long time, up in through the Obama administration. And there was a lot of difficulty for Obama to go through, and there was a lot happening politically for him to go through and to clean out the provisions at that time under No Child Left Behind. But we were finding that schools were falling into under state control, especially in our disproportional Black communities. And so schools were being labeled, oftentimes they were being scrutinized, they were being called out, they were being listed as deficient schools. And so, and again, a lot of those fell in our disproportionately immigrant population communities and our Black communities. And so in 2015, Obama was able to go back in and to reauthorize this bill with changes, taking out a lot of the high stakes testing and standardized requirements. And this ended up pushing this bill out called ESSA, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. And unfortunately, as soon as we see Obama leave office, we have the Trump administration move in, and they dismantled large portions of ESSA. So there was pieces of it that actually were completely removed. So, and again, it was for the new ESSA laws had a lot of pieces in it that had more protections, but unfortunately a lot of those protections for multiple populations were removed or reduced. So in the 1960s and 1970s, we see a lot of amazing work done on the civil rights movement. In particular, we see Cesar Chavez and Dr. Martin Luther King really pushing in on equity-related issues, which we still continue to struggle with despite laws that have been created. So both of these individuals really impacted students of color. Cesar Chavez helped to unite the farm workers under better conditions, and that really did lay better foundation for migrant children in accessing education. There is migrant programs that were put into place, and then also Dr. Martin Luther King as well set a precedence of nonviolence as he fought with students and alongside students. Students were a very important part of Dr. Martin Luther King's message, and really to break down racial barriers within the Black community, but also within the white community and Black community and brown community at large. So in 1971, we see a very interesting decision from the Supreme Court, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Education versus Education, and it's put into place what we call busing. It was a desegregation tool to achieve what we call racial balance. And so districts were then required to look at their communities and work with their communities to make sure that they had racially balanced school sites. And so in doing so, we see a push towards busing students outside of their neighborhoods to other neighborhoods, and so white families busing into maybe Black or brown communities and vice versa. So we see a lot of this busing. Unfortunately, the busing issues created a lot of pushback from predominantly white communities. And so we see a lot of protesting that came about, and a lot of concerns. And so even though this plan was in place, there was a lot of, because of a lot of pushback, we have a lot of states that start doing work to break down this particular law and set up their own desegregation plans, but it didn't include busing. And so a lot of the times, unfortunately, communities went back to largely being segregated, so in the classroom and in communities. So in 1980, we also see this interesting law in 1972, which was the Indian Education Law, which really set up a comprehensive system for Native American and Alaskan Native students. This population is an interesting population. They have very, especially in the homeless education world, their outcomes are very low. And so even though their numbers are smaller, their outcomes are very difficult to look at. They're very dismal. And so the establishment of this was great, but we still struggle with our outcomes. And so there continued needs to be push in on supporting our Native Americans and our Alaskan Native students. So in the 1980s and 90s, again, as I said before, we see a lot of legislation where we're breaking down these desegregation plans. And I think the justification behind it was to return schools to local control. And so, but in doing so, again, we went back to this segregated model. So in 1982, we see Plyer versus Doe, and this is an interesting case because it now requires, and this case is really important to the state of California because you could not deny access to public education for undocumented age children. So children who were coming in largely coming over the border from Mexico and were undocumented, school districts could not discriminate and keep them from an education. So, and that moved into just really reminding schools that they could not request for passport. They could request for documentation. They were reminded that they were not immigration-related agencies, and they needed to be careful or they would be sued for seeking out information to discriminate against undocumented students. So, in April of 1999, unfortunately, we start seeing some very publicized school shootings. These school shootings ranged in all communities. They were very interesting to look at from a statistics point of view, but we see them both in white and brown and Black communities, devastating to school districts as they're trying to figure out how to best service their students and keep them safe, and to not set up into the public eye this sense of that school districts were not safe. And so, and that's been a struggle for school districts. So, and then there was this Harvard Civil Rights Project that popped up in 2000. And sadly, this report had talked about there is now more segregation in 2000 than when busing for desegregation began. So we see that the laws that were put in place to end segregation have actually, it's gone the other way. So in September of 2001, we see 9/11. And then from this, unfortunately, we see a huge climb in racial hate crimes towards Muslims, including students. These students are oftentimes of Middle Eastern descent. So we see a lot of hate crimes and crimes targeted specifically to this population. In 2014, there's a study that came out that as schools opened in the fall of 2014, that a demographic milestone had been reached, and that actually minority students enrolled in K through 12 public schools outnumbered their non-Hispanic white population. So in 2016, Donald Trump was elected as president, and he nominated Betsy DeVos from the Department of Education in 2017, so that was February. Betsy DeVos has no educational background. She has supported educational related pieces in the past, but she has never been a teacher. She has no educational pedagogy background, and so she took over federally for the Federal Department of Education to lead teachers. And so that stung, I think, across the board in education, that we were seeking for educational leadership from an educational leader, and that became very difficult for many of us to swallow and to still swallow as educators. So in 2018 and 19, we see a series of educational strikes, the wages not keeping up with cost of living. And in particular, we saw within our own LAUSD community in the Los Angeles County, a very public strike that occurred due to wages. So, and then demands for support and service, things like nurses and things like counselors, which the community desperately was needing and still needs today. So. In March of 2020, we walk into this pandemic. Actually, I think we were tossed into it. And it has been very interesting all the way across the board. Distance learning, online learning, all the terminology that comes with that. It's been a challenge for educators. It's been a challenge for counselors. It's been a challenge for administrators to be able to connect with students. And so this is particularly difficult when you're talking about homeless students. And in the middle of all of this, we see that unfortunately the very public death of George Floyd. And one of the things that I was extremely sad about is that no one had wished anything for Mr. Floyd, but post that, I wish we were in school, because students, again, oftentimes remind us adults about the importance of equity and racial injustice. And they're usually the ones that push things forward, and their discussions and their information and the way that they view the world is critically important. And to some degree, we've missed that because they're not in school. And so my hope is that when we return back to the classroom, that we will dig deep into those conversations and really bring them forward and have discussions in a classroom setting, because we desperately missed that. So. Just some other layers to consider. One of the big things is we always talk about is where you live often determines where you go to school. And so one of the other layers that I always like to remind people about is redlining. Redlining really decimated the ability for our Black communities to purchase homes in our suburban areas, our areas where there is more space and luxuries of having a suburban community experience. A lot of, unfortunately, our Black families were relegated to decaying inner city systems, and a lot of that had to do with redlining that occurred back in the 1930s. So even though it occurred between 1930s and 60s, we are still paying the price for that. And so we have a lot of families that still struggle to get out of inner city systems because of the system that was set up. And the system was intentionally set up We see that through, there's a great video, if you get a chance to watch it, I think I've included it at the bottom here, that really talks about how this came to be, and that it was pervasive. It was intentional and pervasive. And I think that's where it makes it much more difficult to stand back and to be quiet. It was pervasive and it needs to be stopped. So one of the other things that occurred too is there was a shifting of manufacturing employment. And so that shifting of that employment of jobs from an inner city setting to a suburban setting, we have a lot of our Black families who could not therefore move out to the suburban areas. And a lot of that, again, had to do with the redlining related issues. And so you have a lot of our Black families who are stuck in inner city settings who are now unemployed. And then the unemployment rate obviously comes with other issues such as violence and crime. And so one of the things that we see moving forward is that we have this war on drugs. And underneath the war on drugs, these may not seem like school-related issues, but a lot of the response that came on the war on drugs affected our young Black African-American students. And so that is a huge issue. And it's also, the war on drugs really militarized the response and seeing it versus seeing it as a health crisis. And the laws that came with it have been devastating. This picture down here on my left just talks about the drug possession, the drug prison population, and drugs was a big piece of it. And if you were in possession of drugs, you could not apply for school loans. And so that right there put you out for higher education. You couldn't get into public housing. And so if you had a family and you had a record and you were Black, you could not get into housing, you struggled. So you ended up becoming homeless. And so the devastations behind the war on drugs have had implications that have been far reaching, in particular with our Black communities. One of the things that we talk a lot about in public education, especially at the counseling level, is about the prison pipeline. And we see this cutting of public housing underneath the Clinton administration and this massive increase of jails. And the statistics today are really awful. We see 1 in 23 of our white students potentially have a chance to be incarcerated, but it's a 1 in 4 for our Black children. And so devastating statistics. So some of the things to think about too are the current trends in education. These trends are very interesting. This part here really talks about who's teaching our children. And so our teaching staff is really a demographic mismatch. We have 3.8 million teachers, more or less, sometimes more, sometimes less. 10% of those are female, and it actually went up. It doesn't seem to go down. It seems to be pretty stable up at 77%, and only 23 are male. So most of our white teachers who are female are teaching students that are different than themselves. So white students are often in the minority, with Black and Hispanic and Asian students filling most of their classrooms. So one of the things we talk a little bit about is making sure, especially for teachers, is implicit bias training, because white teachers don't always understand their implicit bias and their biases without intentionally talking about it. And that's one of the big things about racial conversations is you have to dig into them and you have to talk about it. We can't dance around it. We really need to actually get into it with grace and mercy. I always say that we really need to make sure that we are kind to one another as we have the conversation, but we do need to hold each other accountable. And then just talking a little bit about the research in that the positive effects of teachers who are within their community that are of the same race or ethnicity. And that way, in the research itself actually shows that there is better attendance rates, there's lower suspensions, there's a greater graduation rate, and a greater attainment for attending college when you see teachers who are matching their communities. A lot of the times too, we see that teachers are, predominantly white teachers, are driving into communities. They are actually not living in those communities. And so that's a whole nother topic to talk about at another point in time. So So just reaching over to the lens of homelessness. So you have all this stuff that we talked about in education, all these things, and then layering on another layer of homelessness. And so there are a lot of homeless education laws that came in to a place under McKinney-Vento. So Senator McKinney, Senator Vento put a lot of their laws into place in the 80s, and it fell under Title I. Title I is a categorical program. And these laws were really to protect a homeless population. One of the things to be really clear about is that our homeless population is 89% of our homeless population are students of color. So in LA County, we run about 1.5 million students. Of those students, about 66,000 of them are homeless. These are 18-19 school year. And we say these numbers are underreported. So I usually say that our numbers are probably more like 90, between 70 and 90,000 students. And so I don't want to say it seems like not so many when you look at 1.5 million, but when you look at a classroom of 22 students, 1 in every 22 students is homeless. And it really depends on where you work. I worked, most of my teaching was done in underserved populations, unincorporated areas. And so the majority of my classroom would qualify as McKinney-Vento, especially under the doubled up population. So we see here too that the student population has a 70.6 grad rate. I believe the state average is more like 85 or 81, between 81 and 85. And then the college readiness rate is the part that is hard to look at because it's only about a 38% college ready rate, which means a student can graduate, but the chances of them being able to go to college are very slim. So we're talking about a UC and UC systems and private institutions. Even community colleges, they may struggle with once they get there. So, and then the fallout rate from colleges is pretty high. I think underneath foster youth services, it's about 3% that make it there, 1% that actually finish, and we follow some of those same trends, so it's very, very low. So if they get into college, the retention of staying in college doesn't always happen. And then just talking about where we go, kind of where we go from here. And I always talk about racial injustice plus homelessness is compounded trauma. And so for our schools, I honestly believe that it starts at the very beginning. We should be making sure that our teaching programs that are teaching our teachers to teach are very clear about racism and what racism is and what biases, and to make sure that when they're walking into the classroom to start teaching, that they understand the impact that they have with their words and their deeds, and that they need to be congruent. And also just really starting from the top down. So there's accountability to anti-racist practices from the top superintendent to the principals, to teachers, and that we're self-monitoring ourselves to make sure that we are, and holding each other accountable to our actions and behaviors. And then also working to defeat racism, again, as I said before, starts in the classroom. We're advocating for examination of pedagogy practices. I always talk about what's being taught versus what's being caught. So, and teachers, again, that bias related piece. There really needs to be a space in classrooms for these difficult topics and to address them, and really to campaign for diversity in our teaching staff and a higher level of, in particular, male teachers. So, and then supporting our students in homelessness is really making sure that all staff is trained about McKinney-Vento, that they understand the implications and the understanding that our homeless population is 89% colored students. And then connecting the students and families to their homeless liaison within their district to provide services. And during COVID, one of the biggest issues has been equity and technology related pieces. And so distance learning has been very difficult for our homeless students. If a student is missing, we're advocating that districts are making sure that they're checking in with families and making sure to see what those families are at, and that maybe there is an educational barrier that has been set up because of homeless related pieces. So working with older students to see if they need partial credits and eligibility. In education, we say in particular in our homeless world that the diploma, the high school diploma, is a gold ticket because it is a beginning of breaking a cycle. And so we advocate to make sure that we are very carefully watching our homeless students, ensure that they are finishing high school and that they're moving beyond high school. So, and then understanding trauma, which is hugely important, especially the manifestations of trauma, especially if you are dealing, again, with a compounded issue. You have a student of color, a student who's Black or brown, who is experiencing homeless-related issues. You've got compounded trauma, and you need to understand how it's manifesting. So with all that being said, I know I ran that through that super quick. My information contact is here. And I just want to thank you again for allowing me to kind of spend some time talking. So, and I'll pass back over.
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Kotke now that they're fresh in your mind? If you think of some later, you can also put them in the chat. Okay.
Dr. Kotke, if I may, one question. Thank you so much for the historical account. And one thing I gleaned from it, for example, if we consider the historical account forces and conditions that were determinants of access to care, access to public education for kids, and you mentioned them very nicely. Is it safe to say right now, under current conditions, or COVID, the pandemic, are these our modern forces and conditions that are also being determinants for access to public education?
So just to make sure I understand the question. So are you talking about, are we still seeing some of the same things that are happening in the past as happening now?
Yes.
And particularly under the, yes, yeah. And yeah, it's been very concerning because a lot of the times our what we call our housed population, there has been a lot of divide, what we call the digital divide between our housed population and our McKinney-Vento population, and it's huge. It's everything from and connectivity, in particular Wi-Fi services, which we pay for. Our homeless students don't have access to that. So now you're going into this digital system where you're now having to figure out how to make sure that students who are homeless can connect. And are we asking them to pay for service, which we can't in public education?
Right.
And so reconciling those pieces, and districts struggle with it because if you have a large, like my former district had 3,500 identified McKinney-Vento students. That is a lot of students. And if I'm having to provide Wi-Fi structures for them, which includes connectivity, and I have to figure out how to pay for all of that, I, as a district, I'm going to fall off the edge for my budget. There's just the capacity isn't there yet. That has to be reconciled. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is push in on the state level about this digital divide, but it's very, very real. And it's very problematic. And largely, again, you have to remember the numbers of our homeless population are largely African-American and Latinx. And so we need to consider that. And a lot of those situations too are doubled up, which means they are living in housing situations where there may be 4 or 5 families for a single home. And they do not qualify for federal services under HUD. And so it becomes another divide. So there's lots of layers there that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for underscoring those very, very relevant points. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have a question, Dr. Kotke. Well, first of all, can you share the YouTube link on the chat? Because I tried to put it in, but it was wrong.
Okay.
I do have a question regarding, the zero tolerance policies within the schools. And I know a lot of them have discipline policies on, like absenteeism, or chronic absenteeism. So I know now in the situation we're in and regarding this virtual learning, do you see school districts, changing their zero tolerance policies or looking into ways on how they're going to deal with not being in contact with students who might not have that access, to technology? Do you see that as an issue coming and as we're going, into the school year?
Yeah, so it is an issue. Districts are required by both federal and state law to remove any educational barriers. So they have to remove the issues tied to the digital divide. What that has been looking like has been interesting. Again, it's a very fiscal, difficult pill for districts to swallow. So that's part of it. As far as the attendance related pieces, which triggers the chronic absenteeism, I know there has been massive amounts of discussion about attendance. So attendance is what spikes chronic absenteeism. And so there hasn't been a really clear plan from the state as to how districts will do attendance. They're actually still working out a lot of those issues. But what we have advocated and told districts constantly is that they need to have a plan when students aren't showing up, and they need to make sure that that plan is well communicated across the board, and especially with teachers. So teachers are your front line because they're the ones who are interacting with the students. And so really making sure that teachers are aware of when a student is not showing up, what is their plan as far as who is they contacting, and then who, when they contact that person, what is that person doing to connect with that family. As far as triggering chronic absenteeism or truancy related pieces right now, a lot of the times they haven't been able to use that right now because it may actually be a digital divide issue. So if it's a digital divide issue, they can't use truancy. They can't use truancy related laws to drive missing students if they have a digital divide in place. I'm not sure if that helped. I know on the tolerance related, oh my goodness, you had to use the word and my brain is tired. I'm not going to remember what you said. So I'm not sure if I answered that correctly.
You did. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right, so next we'd like to welcome in Jose Smith. Jose Smith serves as the Senior Program Specialist in the Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, LACO. With the oversight of 16 school districts, including LAUSD and South Bay school districts, his primary focus is to ensure foster youth receive all the appropriate educational services they are entitled to, and has built a collaborative with various community colleges and California State University Fullerton to facilitate foster youth opportunities for higher learning. Also, he has conducted trainings to colleges and universities on trauma-informed practice for schools. In previous roles, he worked for 15 years as a social worker with the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, and then as a CFT facilitator and coach developer. Jose is graduated as a first-generation college student from California State University Fullerton with a BA in sociology, and went on to earn his master's in educational counseling and his pupil personal service credential, PPS, from the University of Laverne. Please welcome in Jose Smith.
Thank you so much. And I really look forward to this opportunity to share a little bit with everyone that's on this call, the perspective of foster youth in education as it relates to equity. And I also just want to commend my colleague Jennifer for doing a great job. I think she laid a really great framework for the discussion that I'm going to also continue to talk on in regards to education, but specifically from the foster youth perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and get ready to share my screen if I have rights. I'll go ahead.
Absolutely. Please do.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody see that? I'm going to go ahead and also get this ready to go so we can start the slideshow. Okay, can everyone see that?
Thank you. Yep,
Perfect.
go ahead, please.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the foster youth education through the lens of equity. And the first thing that I want to do is talk about what Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program is with LACO. Many of you may not know who we are. LACO is a huge organization. It has a lot of different divisions and programs underneath it. And one of those programs is Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program. And basically we are tasked with providing technical assistance to over 81 school districts in LA County which also includes training. So it's not just answering calls and fielding questions. We also provide training on many topics. We actually have a training menu. One of those is trauma-informed practice, but there's a lot of other trainings that we also provide. We are broken up into 5 regions, which each has 14 to 16 school districts. Now, in my bio, I didn't change it because I figured I'd explain it. I was with LAUSD and the 16 school districts in the South Bay, but most recently I am in transition to our Region 4, which is what you call SPA 7, which is a lot of the same school district cities. So I'm in transition starting with that new region, which is also Region 4, but I still have my hand in Region 5 as we are looking for someone new to work with and continue the work there. We hold about 4 to 6 regional learning network meetings per year. This is a time when we get together with all our local districts in our region. So we send out an invite to the 14 to 16 school districts. We also invite local colleges and universities, as well as agencies, DCFS, and as well as a lot of other community-based organizations. And what we do is we meet collaboratively in order to discuss not only the problems with foster youth education and the barriers and the challenges that they face, but also how can we work through them and what are some solutions that we can come up with as a group, and actually to gain buy-in from all the stakeholders, because LACO is in no way going to sit here and try to say we have all the answers. We realize that it's going to be a community effort, and that if we all don't come together, then our foster youth are not going to receive the best and the fullest education that they possibly can receive. And some of the things that we want to, of course, overcome are equity issues, which I'm going to get into in regards to a lot of what were the outcomes of these meetings, as well as what are the things that we are overcoming regarding the equity imbalance. Now, as a COE, County Office of Education, we are now tasked by the State Assembly to ensure that FAFSA completion for foster youth is something that is embedded within our goal system as an agency, as a County Office of Ed. So not only LA County Office of Ed, but all the counties in California, we are now tasked to make sure that this is a new goal. It's always been a goal to assist foster youth with post-secondary education, but not necessarily specific to the FAFSA. We've been doing a lot of work on the FAFSA, and I'm going to talk about that later in the presentation. But this is a brief overview of what I do and my other 4 colleagues do in our program, a Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program for LA County. So here are some foster youth facts that I would like to share, because I don't want to assume everybody knows. But basically, foster youth are the lowest performing of all subgroups educationally. It's an unfortunate fact that they do not perform as well when it comes to all the other subgroups, EL, homeless. They are the lowest performing, and that's what we have to realize. And a lot of this is because of not only the barriers that they have to overcome in foster care, but also the trauma that comes about as the reason that they're in foster care. And then the continual trauma that continues by being moved from one home to the other, to the next, from one school district to the next school district. Another interesting fact, which has always caught me and still catches me by surprise, is that 67 to 73%, and it ranges because every year it goes up or down, of all female foster youth are pregnant by the age of 18. That is a huge, huge, huge statistic, because that in no way mirrors general population. I think if in the general population, 67 to 73% of all female students in any high school across America was pregnant, it would be a national issue. But the reality is this is what the foster youth female population actually has going on right now. Only 3% of all foster youth go on to graduate from college. So that's another somber statistic, not a very good statistic when it comes to post-secondary. And there are tons and tons and tons of other stats that I can give regarding foster youth, but I wanted to focus more on what we are actually doing to improve some of these outcomes and how we can connect with you as agencies and programs to also collaborate in overcoming a lot of the obstacles that these foster youth face educationally. Now, another fact, I'm going to continue, is that there is a disproportionality of African American youth in foster care. And what do I mean by that? African American students are only 11 to 13% of the population in LA County. However, when it comes to children in foster care, they make up 68% of the youth in foster care. That is a huge disproportionate number. A proportionate number, to put it in perspective, would be the Latino community. So Latino students are about 48% of the county population, and they make up about 47 to 49% of foster youth in foster care. That is a equal proportion. So the amount of students in the population equals the amount of students in foster care. But as you can tell with African American students, their amount of their population numbers in the county is a lot less in proportion to the number of students and foster youth in the foster youth system. So disproportionality is something that has been on the radar of DCFS. It was on our radar when I was working with DCFS over 5 years ago, and it continues to be on the radar because it has not really changed. There might be a percentage point here and there that has changed. There are a lot of efforts that are being pioneered by the Department of Children and Family Services in regards to what they call the Cultural Broker Program. And the Cultural Broker Program is basically trying to find members of the community, of the African American community, that can be involved at the onset of a case so that the families feel as if though they are being supported by members of their community, and members of their community can act as liaisons with the department as an agency. Because the unfortunate fact is more African American youth are detained and removed from their homes than any other population when it comes to the proportionality. Now, another sad fact about foster youth is that they experience implicit bias. And what I mean by that is many times they are looked at as the troubled kids by the systems that are supposed to be there to support them, such as education, their own social workers, and sometimes even their own therapists. And what do I mean by this? Basically, they experience higher rates of suspensions and expulsions than most populations, than the general population of the students. Now, something that I did not put here is also that about 60% of all foster youth have an IEP. That is a huge, huge number. Now, does that mean that all the foster youth that are detained have educational disabilities before their detention? No, it just means that because of their detention, because of the trauma, because of their unfortunate circumstances of having to move from one school to the next, there are educational barriers that have caused their learning to be impacted. The unfortunate truth is that the first response sometimes by education is give them an IEP, request let's get him an IEP, let's get him what he needs. The other sad fact is that many foster parents, which we now call resource parents, sometimes the first thing that they want in the old system, and I'll explain what that means, of foster care, is they want their foster youth to have an IEP because in certain cases it would translate to more money as a caregiver than if they didn't have an IEP. So that would frustrate me as a social worker and a supervisor, because I would look at the child and I'd say, hey, this child does not have horrible grades. What do you mean you want him to have an IEP? You need to give me a better reason. But the truth is sometimes they would go to court and they would get the IEP as something that needed to be pursued. And these are situations, again, this is implicit bias because somebody else is trying to benefit from their unfortunate circumstance. There is a rise of IEPs for foster youth. You go to a general population student, high school or school, 50 to 60% of the students are not on IEPs. Again, that's a disproportionate number that youth experience in education. Another example of some of the implicit bias that the children face is they are not providing with their full rights per the law. So for example, CFT meetings, which are called Child and Family Team Meetings, they are a type of meeting that is better than the old formatted meeting from 8 years ago. These CFT meetings are a lot better. And if you can't hear me, let me know, because the gardeners are front and backyard, and I don't know if you can hear that, but I definitely can. So please let me know if you're not able to hear me speak, and I'll speak louder. I know I'm trying to hear myself talk, so I apologize about that. But in regards to the CFT meetings, they're set up in a way that are supposed to be family focused. And I'm going to get into that later regarding the location of the meeting, the invitees of the meeting, and school choice. So I will be talking about that. I wanted to put that out there just to let you know that even in something that's supposed to be there to help the family, there are inequalities. And also, the sad fact is foster youth are the most heavily medicated youth as a group compared to the general population. And this was per an independent court study led by Judge Nash, I want to say over 8 or 9 years ago, that basically found he was the presiding judge of children's court and juvenile court at that time. And he had enough sense to realize, why are our kids so medicated? Why is every single foster youth coming in to my courtroom under such heavy medication? So he basically spurred an investigation, but from the court perspective, and there's a report that basically states that, yes, they are over medicated. And that was, I want to say, as of 8 to maybe 9 years ago that report came out. I don't know what the current outcome is of that regarding youth on medication, but I can tell you that as of 4 or 5 years ago, they were still pretty heavily medicated. So beyond just, again, looking at the general population versus our foster youth, they have more IEPs, they have higher suspension, higher expulsions, they have more medication ascribed to them. And to just say it's because of foster care, it really, all these things impact their learning. And I wanted to show you that perspective in regards to what foster youth face. Now, I want to talk about something regarding foster youth, which is current and on the radar in regards to school of origin rights. Now, school of origin rights is something that stemmed from ESSA, which Jennifer mentioned earlier, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which basically means that foster youth are entitled to attend their school of origin in order to stop the constant movement. So let me give you an example. If a student was removed from Paramount and then got placed in Compton, and now has to go to Compton, and now, 6 months later, the caregiver got mad at the youth and said he needs to go. Now the child is no longer in Compton, but now moved to Whittier. Now that child has to go to California High in Whittier. And now something happened at Whittier where mom is going to reunify with the child, but mom lived all the way back in, let's say, Lawndale. Now the child has to go back to where the school is with mom is in Lawndale. That child has gone to 4 schools in maybe a span of 18 months. And not once has the child been asked, hey, what school do you want to go to? What school do you want to stay at? In other words, the adults in this situation are what dictated where the child went to school, ultimately implicating and ultimately impacting the child's education more than anybody else's. So what this School of Origin Rights does is it lays out the 3 guiding factors as to what a school of origin is, which is huge because it requires the districts, the foster youth liaisons at the districts, and every district has a foster youth liaison, to ask the foster youth coming into their school, what is your school of origin? Do you still want to come here? Or would you rather go to a prior school that you attended in the last 15 months? Or would you rather go to the school that you were detained from? Or would you rather stay here and continue to go to school here? Now, this unfortunately is also an area of implicit bias, and I'm going to tell you why. Not every foster youth liaison is asking this question as foster youth enter their schools. I know schools are busy, and I know schools have a lot on their plate, and a lot of these foster youth liaisons are not only solely foster youth liaisons, they are also special ed, they are also homeless, they are also a lot of other programs. and foster youth may be a sliver of the youth that they help in their schools under student support services. But unfortunately, these students aren't being asked this question. And the truth is, many of these students aren't going to walk into the office and say, I demand my school of origin rights to be adhered to. I demand a best interest determination meeting. They're not going to advocate for themselves that way. And this is another area of implicit bias, because these youth have a right to be where they want to be. And if the advocates, the adults, the agencies, the caregivers, the schools, even the therapists that meet with them don't know, hey, you have a right. You know, we should talk to your social worker. Hey, you know, we should call your foster youth liaison at the school and let them know that you would like to go back to your school of origin, not stay here. Now, the other caveat to this is, before it was just the law that said this had to happen, but there was no means to an end. Schools did not have transportation to provide. Who was going to foot the bill to get the child to that school? If a caregiver had 3 kids and they all went to Compton and one kid wanted to go to Downey High, the caregiver would say something to the effect, I'm not going to drive him all the way to Downey High. I got to take 3 kids to 2 different schools in Compton. I don't have time to get him to Downey High. He's going to a Compton school. And that was the end of it. Whereas now the Department of Children and Family Services, along with LACO, are together working on transportation plans. There are memorandums of understanding now to ensure that students are able to get bused to their school of origin based on the outcome of what's called a best interest determination meeting. Now that piece is so important also, because what it does is it removes the barriers of the department making the decision, of the school making the decision, and or the caregivers making the decision for the youth as to what school the child is going to. And now in that best interest determination requires that the ERH, or the ed rights holder, be contacted and asked, what school do you want your child to go to? What is the best place for your child? And that puts so much power back into the hands, 90% of the time they're the parents saying, mom, dad, or guardian, where do you want your child to go to? And that was a move in the right direction by this law, but it's an even greater move through the implementation by the efforts of LACO, as well as all the school districts that are working together, as well as the Office of Child Protection with LA County as the Board of Supervisors that's kind of put this on their plate saying, make it happen. It seems like things are moving into the right place. And like Jennifer stated, sometimes laws are passed, but by the time they get implemented, years have passed. Think about it, ESSA 2015, and here we are 2020, and we still do not have all of our foster youth being offered school of origin rights. We as foster youth liaison, we as senior program specialists, we work with our districts to train them, to encourage them, to give them all the information, but ultimately it's up to the district to request this of the foster youth and of the ed rights holder. If the districts don't do it, many times the social workers won't either, and many times we won't know about it. Now, this is basically something that I wanted to put out there. It's something that has the potential to break down barriers, but there are still barriers that are there that we're trying to break through so that this could be fully implemented. Another area of, I want to say success, is the child and family team meetings. These are meetings that are meant to be strength-based, family-driven, and supported by a team that the family and the youth create. Now, this is a DCFS formatted meeting. And when I was at DCFS, I was trained as a facilitator, then a coach developer. I was charged with training a whole office staff of 300, as well as other offices. And being a facilitator for the prior type of meeting, this meeting takes the cake because it is family focused, it is strength based, and it's driven by the family. And basically the team is created by the family. This is huge because prior to this, it was the social worker calling the therapist, the counselor, the family preservation worker, the placement worker, anybody else that the worker wanted to invite, and the family never got to bring anybody that they wanted to bring to these meetings. Very unfair, very unfortunate. what this has done is it basically puts the power back into the planning power back into the family's hands, including the older children if they're in high school, as well as the parents. Now, unfortunately, there's still some implicit bias that goes on, because I'll tell you this as a prior social worker, the CFT process is a 4-meeting process. It is not just a one-time meeting. There is a pre-meeting, there is a family engagement meeting, which is kind of prepping the family, giving them the agenda, letting them know what to expect. Then there's the actual meeting, and then there's a debrief meeting for the staff. This process of 4 meetings, unfortunately, because social workers are so overworked, causes the fact to take place that they skip some of those steps. They skip the first meeting, they skip the family engagement meeting, and they just jump right into the meeting, sometimes not allowing the family to invite their own supports, not giving the family a chance to state, you know, I don't really want that person at my meeting. So the right to choose location and time of the meeting sometimes gets infringed on also. And most of the time, sadly, education doesn't even make it into the topic regarding this meeting. So these are areas where the child family team meeting is moving in the right direction, trying to overcome barriers, but yet there continues to be this implicit institutional privilege that takes place, where the institutions, those in power, are making decisions based on their schedules, based on their maybe agendas, versus based on the family needs and the family requirements and the family requests. So we have a long way to go with that. And I'm bringing it up for a reason, because most recently, out of our collaborative group in our South Bay, we were able to combine CFTs and education partners together. Basically, as a result of our collaboration, as we all came together, we were able to state, you know what, CFTs are great, but we need education at the table. So I really want you to know that education is someone that needs to be invited to the team and to these meetings. Parents don't think about teachers. Parents don't think about foster youth liaisons. Kids don't think about counselors. Kids don't think about teachers. They're thinking their school life is separate than their DCFS involvement life. What we as a group all on this call need to understand, and if you can spread the word, education can be one of the greatest allies for these students, because these students are, well, not now because of COVID, but they were exposed to these students' lives for 6 to 8 hours a day. They know what the student is about. They know what the student is facing, and they are able to give really, really good input into what a student's plan should be overall, even as it relates to the family reunifying, even as it relates to the child succeeding in school as well as in their family. So what we did was we found a way that we were able to collaborate with 7 school districts and a total of 14 school sites that were willing to be CFT host sites, because one of the premises is that the CFT shouldn't be at the DCFS office. It's very sterile there, it's very one-sided. So it could be at the family home, or it could be in a neutral location. So what has happened as a result of, excuse me, this collaborative is that school districts have agreed to basically say, hey, we'll be a host site. And what that does is it almost by default causes their representative at that school site to be then invited. I say by default, but the family still has to invite the foster youth liaison. And all that happened right before COVID, so we haven't had a chance to actually see it come to fruition, but the plan was set, the districts agreed, and this is something that I'm looking forward to bringing to Region 4, which is a lot of the SPOS 7 school districts, in trying to get DCFS to collaborate with the school districts so that there could be more of a community approach to working with our families in DCFS, as well as our children that have experienced trauma, as well as our students that are experiencing inequities in schools. And I just want to let you know your involvement in these meetings can really translate to more support and services for our families, and less of a chance of implicit bias, because the more advocates they have, the less of a chance that they're going to experience this unfortunate bias that can occur. Another area that we came to kind of plan around as a group is the foster youth and the FAFSA. I touched on that earlier. Now the financial aid application basically needs to be completed in a totally different way for a foster youth than does the general population. Some of this implicit bias that would occur in a school site, for example, would be like this. School district, we are a foster youth services coordinating program. We want to be able to set up a FAFSA workshop specific to foster youth. And the response we would get is like, oh no, we have 4 workshops for financial aid throughout the year. We're covered, we don't need you. But what they don't realize is that they are giving a general spiel of how to complete the FAFSA, asking students, make sure you bring your parents' W-2s, make sure that, you know, we have your parents' income. And these foster youth hear that and they say, wait a minute, my parents' W-2s, I haven't lived with my mom and dad for 2 years. I'm not gonna talk to them, forget it, I'm not going. And what happens is they implicitly exclude themselves because they don't wanna have to deal with, let me call my mom, let me call my dad, let me get their W-2s. And secondly, what they sometimes translate that as like, well, my mom and dad don't have custody of me, so let me ask my caregiver. And the caregiver may have a full-time job, she's middle-wage earner and brings in a W-2 that does not qualify them for financial aid. So again, these are barriers because these certain things are set up in a way where if you don't know that the FAFSA has to be completed totally different for a foster youth, right away, foster youth are just not gonna complete the FAFSA. Right away, foster youth are going to exclude themselves from any services that the school already has in place. So what we've done is, through our collaborative, is we set up FAFSA workshops at actually collaborating districts and colleges. I mean, literally we had 3 college tour and FAFSA workshops planned for foster youth, but then COVID hit, so they all had to get canceled. At Pierce College, at Harbor College, as well as at Santa Monica College. So what we are now looking at is when all this COVID stuff lifts, is we also don't just want to look at having it at at school sites, but also possibly at agencies. So I know one of the agencies in Region 4 has already reached out to me and says, hey, you guys can have a workshop here. We'll have the laptops, you bring the kids in, that's all you need. And these are the things that the RLNs, the Regional Learning Network, does. It works together collaboratively to provide opportunities for youth to complete something that implicitly, if they don't have this opportunity, they're going to basically experience some bias at their regular high school. And that's just the fact. Most high schools don't just have a FAFSA workshop separate for their foster youth just because. If they do, it's because we've contacted them or we're working with them. So there's a lot of opportunity here. Now, the good news this year for foster youth is that they actually outperformed the general population at FAFSA completion. This is our 3rd year of doing this. And this year, 64.5% of seniors in foster care completed the application, compared to 56.6% of all general population seniors. Basically, almost an 8%, we outperformed the general population of completing the FAFSA by 8%. And that's only because of the collaboration that existed to overcome these barriers that were there for so long for foster youth. When we first started, the completion rate was 13% 3 years ago, 13%. Then it went up to 33, then it went up to 56. And now here we are at 64.5. And that is because of the community involvement, not just in my region, but all across the county, and the collaboration that existed between colleges and DCFS and ILP at DCFS and LACO. And this is the type of work I believe that needs to be done in order to overcome these systemic barriers that exist, especially when it comes to education. So basically, my whole message today is you can all make a huge difference by 2 things. And that's by understanding foster youth challenges and barriers, and intentionally being a support to them and their families by letting them know, did you know you are entitled to invite anyone you want to a CFT? Did you know that your student, your son, your daughter can complete the FAFSA in a certain way where they will always get anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 a year for financial aid just because of their involvement in foster care. I mean, these are things that families don't know. And these are things that many times our agencies and our community partners don't realize. And they think, oh, we'll leave DCFS to handle that, or we'll leave the agencies to handle that. But it takes more than just DCFS and LACO. It takes really the community. It takes mental health. It takes the Department of Public Health. It takes the Boys and Girls Clubs. It takes local churches. It takes so many people beyond just education and beyond just DCFS to make an impact and overcome these barriers that, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, our foster youth automatically face. And as we all do our part, I believe those disproportionate numbers are actually going to change, hopefully. So that basically concludes my message today in regards to foster youth through the lens of education and the equity issues that they face. And here's my information. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions. I'm not sure if I overspoke or if we have time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. We appreciate your contribution.
Does anybody have any questions? Or again, if you're shy or remember something later, you can always put questions in the chat. We will have time, a little bit of time at the end for additional questions.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment. Jose, I really want to thank you for your presentation today. You validated much of my experience working with foster youth as a school principal. I spent 14 years as a school principal, and I spent 5 of those also as a district director. And the things that you talked about with regard to caregivers coming, insisting on IEPs when we knew that the children were absolutely fine in terms of not needing special ed support was such a struggle for us, because we would hear rumors from the community that, to your point, the only reason that they're doing that is so that they can get more money. And it was just really devastating. And then when they would come to the meetings and we would go through the process and determine that their foster child was not going to receive support, sometimes we wouldn't see the child again. And that was really equally as devastating. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And you took me back to my frustration in the time when I was a principal, and we would have many caregivers very angry with us about the fact that we were not going to support them with special ed. They would want to threaten the school district. And, their threats were, fell on deaf ears, because the child clearly was, brilliant or really smart or, just so capable. So thank you for that. It's important, I think, for the public to know that, unfortunately, and I'll just speak for myself, public schools go through this so often, and we feel so frustrated because we have a passion to serve our foster youth, and we get roadblocks put in front of us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but it was very real.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jose. And one thing I took away from your passionate delivery was, let's take convenience, let's work not out of convenience, but out of commitment. And I think that can resonate for every service provider, that it's our commitment that really should be driving our efforts. Thank you again. Appreciate your contribution.
So next we have Lisa Michelle Dabbs, the clerk of the East Whittier City School District. In addition to, Lisa holds the office of clerk at the East Whittier City School District. In addition to being an educational and social media consultant and owner of Lisa Dabbs Consulting with an extensive educational background, she has variably served as school principal, federal project director, and teacher, while being an award-winning blogger, author, podcaster, and speaker. Lisa is internationally recognized education leader in the field of new teacher development, and has written a number of publications, including in the Huffington Post, Education Week, Smart Brief Education, and is a published author herself, has written the book Standing in the Gap, Empowering New Teachers Through Connected Resources. Mrs. Dabbs holds a Master's in Education degree and Educational Administration from the University of Laverne and has a BA in Child Development. Additionally, Mrs. Dabbs has taught as a university adjunct professor in the areas of school administration. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Lisa Michelle Dabbs.
Hi, everyone, and thank you. Cecilia, do I have permissions to share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's see if this all works out the way that we want. Let's see. I think this is the right. Let's see if this is the right one. Can you see my screen?
Yes. You just need to put it in presentation mode.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. I'm going to go fix this a little bit here. So I first want to thank Cecilia Reyes and all of the wonderful people at First Day for inviting me to speak. Unlike my predecessors who are speaking, I come to you representing myself as a school board member. And I also come to you as a person who is passionate to serve in that role, as I have been passionate to serve in my roles that Cecilia shared with you. I want to let you know that my short brief presentation is adapted from one that's about an hour and a half to 2 hours that was done by our district and our superintendent around the 2020-2021 plan for reopening our school district. So where my esteemed predecessors shared very global, very eagle-eye views in terms of equity in the various things they talked about, I'm going to share something that's much smaller. It is more of a focus on how the East Whittier City School District is going to work to reopen schools, and how we have to be very, very mindful, as we were in March, to address now even more so the issues of equity in our work. So there are hundreds of equity issues in public schools, but for us in our small district, and it is very small, even though we're the larger district K-8 in Whittier, we are actually just a district of under 8,600 students. And so we are not a unified school district. We are simply a K-8 district. And within the context of that, we see the issues that our larger school districts around us might experience, but oftentimes, and of course on a much smaller scale. And the ones that we see most often are the ones that I've listed here, the issues that were spoken of by Dr. Kopke and Jose, the digital divide, accessibility, the need for supporting our second language learners, our children who may be living in poverty, and that could even include our homeless, and then our children who, even within the context of not living in poverty, come to school hungry because in the past they would have, coming from working families, coming from homes where both parents work, and those parents are not able to because they're providing for their families to be able to prepare a lunch or prepare a breakfast. So these are just a few of the many equity issues that present themselves to our district, but I feel that they are, for our discussions today, they're the most important. Our plan for reopening has 4 phases, and you can see them there. And just so you all know, our plan for reopening was abruptly changed when Governor Newsom made his statements last Friday around the fact that if a county had been on the monitoring list for the last 14 days, no schools in that county could reopen until they were off the monitoring list for 14 days. So what we experienced was on Monday of that same week, he was asked whether or not he was going to step into reopening schools in California, and he said no. Friday, he had to walk that back and present an entirely different issue of control, if you will, over how schools up and down the state of California were going to reopen. But for us in Los Angeles County in particular. So as I talk about this, I want you to know that these are some of the equity issues in particular that we have around reopening schools and around making sure that equity is our focus. And they are around providing tools such as Chromebooks to all our students, providing hotspots for our students who do not have access to internet, finding ways that students, families who could afford inexpensive internet have access to how they can gain that, how they can seek programs to support them, lunches and breakfasts, which are critical for them. And there are many others that I'm not going to take all the time to speak about. But what I do want to let you know is that when the pandemic hit and we had to shut down in March, we became very focused on these and on providing Chromebooks for all our students, providing hotspots, and of course, Verizon in our community offered free internet support, and we were able to get as many parents and families as possible to have access to that. So not only was it something that we worked very hard to support in March, but now we will continue to do that even more so, as we have not heard from our internet providers that they will be giving free internet support again. It's something that we hope will happen. But in the meantime, we have to grapple with how we look at that. We are very fortunate, however, though, to be able to offer a Chromebook, a tech tool to our children. But I'll speak in a little bit about how that becomes a very interesting problem. I want you to know that as a school district, we do not just decide what we want to do. Our guidance, especially in light of what the governor shared on Friday, comes from Los Angeles County Office of Education, the Los Angeles County Health Department, and the State Department of Ed. In other words, when Governor Newsom made his statements on last Friday, there would not be actually abilities to change that. Now, within the context of that, we have received emails from parents asking us to apply for a waiver, because shortly after Governor Newsom shared that watch list districts with schools could not open, or communities could not open, it was immediately followed with a statement, not by him, but by others, that waivers could be applied for. But just so you all know, within the context of the complicated and complex way a district would have to go after a waiver, currently, we don't qualify for that waiver. Lastly, our board voted in a special meeting on Monday to approve opening schools in a distance learning plan. So our guiding principles, I'm not going to read all of them here, are set up so that our parents, our teachers, our staff, our community knows that we have thought these things through. We are not flying by the seat of our pants. We are not wondering about what we should do. We have been strategic and targeted and focused in terms of looking at ways that we can provide schooling to children. In the past, it was going to be offering some options, but now in terms of distance learning. And our bylaws guide us. We have done a tremendous amount of outreach and communication. I really want to let you all know this and focus on this just for a while, just for a few minutes. Weeks ago, we came forward to the superintendent as board members and asked if we could provide town halls. In other words, provide meetings for our community, our parents, our teachers to join us in a presentation and then a Q&A session. So I want you all to know that we are one of the very few districts, and I mean very few, that have actually offered 6 town halls, 3 in English and 3 in Spanish, that prior to the governor's statement provided detailed 2 to 2.5 hours of meeting time where parents were allowed to raise a hand in Zoom and ask questions. And we took numerous questions. Our superintendent took many, many, many minutes of time that oftentimes moved into 2.5 hours to answer those important questions. Some of the questions 6 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, we didn't have answers to. And honestly, as you all know, this lens is changing daily. This lens of how we open, when we open, what's going to happen with distance learning education as we open changes daily. We are still looking for guidance from Los Angeles County Office of Ed in terms of drilling down to the very specific ways that we will open. But we made a very, very systemic and target and systematic focus to support our parents. I will let you know that they were very well attended. Our first town hall had over 800 parents and community in attendance on Zoom. And parents were very, very grateful, even if we couldn't answer their questions specifically in more detail, they were very grateful for that. So one of the ways that we are very cognizant of providing issues of equity is transparency. We find that our districts around us at times do not provide that transparency. Now, I know this because I am in communication with fellow board members and with teachers in surrounding districts who have said, Lisa, do you have openings? Can we come teach for you? So as Jose and Dr. Kopke shared, our hope is that as we do things, they will spill over positively into surrounding districts who would say, wow, that is a really great thing that East Whittier City School District did. We would like to model that and do that. And in kind, we sometimes and will continue to do that as well. Of course, earlier, as we thought that we were going to have options for opening, we had focused on tremendous efforts to make sure that our openings following the Los Angeles County Health Department regulations were going to be safe, that the places of our classrooms and our schools were going to be as safe as they could have been for our children. We have purchased fogging machines, hand sanitizers, PPE. You can see the list is here and it goes on and on. Signage so that parents are not in the dark about where do I go and how do I do it. We had detailed plans that are still waiting should the time come for us to be able to reopen perhaps in a hybrid model, providing entrance and exit and timing. And so I share that with you here so you can see that, again, within the context of equity, no school has been left behind. We have 13 schools, 3 of which are middle and the other 10 elementary. Every single school is going to be, when the time comes again, provided with all of the supports you see here in an effort to be sure that there is not one single solitary school site or classroom that is not being attended to in the highest possible manner. So let me share with you briefly what our plans look like now that we are opening in distance learning. Transitional kindergarten is a different animal all to itself, and we are still honestly working with the county to see how we will do that, because transitional kindergarten in the original plan shared with us by Los Angeles County could not be done any other way than in person. You realize that these children are the youngest prior to preschool, and because transitional kindergarten isn't mandated by the state, it may in fact be, unfortunately, that transitional kindergarten will not be able to be offered, not because our district doesn't want to offer it, but as we wait for guidance from Los Angeles County Office of Ed, it could in fact become an issue. So don't quote me on that. I'm just sharing my thoughts about what may happen. However, for elementary and middle schools, I can share with you here that this is our distance learning model. It has been developed from the ground up. In other words, we as board members, our superintendent, our cabinet have not said, do as I say. On the contrary, we gathered together groups of teachers, administrators, parents, support staff to give us input in terms of how they would want to see either the hybrid model, which I'm not sharing here today, but this distance learning model to roll out. So I want you to know that we have taken the time to choose to be equitable in the way that we have selected our community, selected our stakeholders to give us input in terms of how things should be opening for us and how our distance learning program will look. Might we have to make some tweaks? Yes, it's possible. But up until today, this is what it looks like. We will meet again on the 27th of July for a full board meeting where we are being expected to receive this Friday updates from Los Angeles County in terms of what the distance learning model could look like, should look like. And so we're hoping that with this plan that we've developed, that we will be right there on the money in terms of what it will look like. And you'll see that in order for our children to receive time for social and emotional learning time, so that across our district, the equity issues of mental health are addressed. Every single day, our children from elementary through middle school will have this time, although short, to work specifically with their teachers in the area of social learning time. Will it be a morning meeting style or something else? That will depend on the teachers, but they will be given insights and opportunities and strategies by which they can do that social emotional learning time. It won't just be, hey all, how you doing? It's going to be a specific fun time or a specific talking time or a specific interaction time where the thoughts and the emotions of our children, as best our teachers can do, they're not trained counselors, but they are going to be aware of the needs of our children and be able to address that. And then, especially in the middle schools, bring that to a counselor should there be some more detailed issues of concern. And here you'll see the same model for middle school, again, addressing the social emotional learning time. Our middle schools, we are very, very fortunate to have counselors there, and we have deep connections in our district to support the middle schools and the elementary schools, although we don't have counselors there. But our counselors are shared and they are able to deploy should they be needed at our elementary schools. So one of the things that we have made sure to do, again, to provide equity and transparency in the area of accessibility, is to constantly update a site that is for parents. They can go to ewcsd.org for parents or for staff. They're able to click on the distance learning plan. They're able to see the plan in greater detail if they haven't been able to come to our town halls or if they're not able to come to our meetings that we hold on Zoom. There are abilities for our parents especially to be able to see things they might have missed. So nothing is hidden unless it's something that is confidential that cannot be shared. And again, friends, this is something I have heard from surrounding districts and friends who teach in other districts over the hill and beyond. Oh my gosh, we have nothing like this. So in the issue of accessibility, in the issue of making sure that we're being fully transparent, we really want to make sure that our parents know what it is that we're working on, what it is that we have in place, and that if there's something they have a question about, they're able to email and get answers. In terms of intervention, we know that there are going to be, even in the distance learning model, there are going to be questions, there's going to be concerns. You can see there, and I didn't take it off because I wanted you to be able to see at least here, that our plans to do a hybrid, a partial in-person was available, and it's very robust and very detailed. But here you can see that we know that intervention is key to supporting our struggling students. We know that the equity in terms of how our children learn and grow and process is so important. And how that happens now in a distance learning only focus is very clearly detailed. So you can see there under the what the instruction and the when and the who. And here, this will be updated to state K-8. So in that social emotional learning time that I talked about, you may wonder, well, what if a teacher doesn't know how to approach that? What if that is something that's not comfortable for him or her? Here we have in place opportunities where we will be providing professional development for our teachers, professional development done by our in-school staff so that teachers feel that they have gotten initial support and will have people they can go to for continuous support. It's not enough for us as a school district to simply say, and you will do this. Where are we doing the undergirding for them? Where are their safety nets so that teachers feel like, oh good, I'm doing this SEL and I don't feel like, what am I gonna do? So here I share with you a slide that we presented where we will be providing not only that professional development initially, but ongoing support to our teachers and then possibly to our families should they need it in this time of distance learning. Within the context of that, I'll say quickly, we also must absolutely make sure that we are following all of our guidelines for our special ed children. We are really looking more deeply in terms of how the distance learning model affected our special ed students prior, so that as we go forward, there will be much more targeted intervention for them. As was mentioned, we were thrown into this distance learning model in March with little or no opportunity to prepare. But now we are prepared. Now we know our teams, our director have done a tremendous amount of work to prepare for special education so that, again, the equity issues of our special ed students are not infringed on, that they are having the same accessibility to a quality education in distance learning as the other children and or their peers. And so within the context of that, we always have to look at the different variances of our special ed children. So updates will be made in terms of how this looks in distance learning with guidance, again, not only from our teams here on the ground in our district, but also from Los Angeles County Office of Ed. Our parent partnerships are really, really important. And again, I just want to stress, we have done a tremendous amount of work to make sure that parents feel that they're being heard, that parents know that we want to hear from them, and that they have opportunities to communicate with us. So we sent out a survey prior to the governor's statement, and we received over 6,000. In fact, I think we received over 6,400 responses from parents where we asked them to let us know, do you want to return or would you prefer distance learning? And within the context of that, there were a much deeper dive with more questions. The highest percentage of parents in elementary school wanted to return via distance learning. We had a higher number, smaller but higher number of parents in middle school who were excited about the hybrid model. But now that we know, and now that our parents know through the outreach that we've made on Friday, that we are returning in a distance learning model, they will have opportunity now to have that sink in and then come to our meeting on Monday to hear in greater detail a much more robust version of what that will look like. One of the things that Governor Newsom stated over and over is that any district in the state of California that is opening under the distance learning quote unquote mandate must do so in a rigorous manner. So your rigorous might not be my rigorous, but in general, we have to be sure, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we return in a rigorous model that supports our children in the best way that we can in a distance learning model to receive a very profound, excellent education. In terms of our parent education, we want to make sure that continues. So we did a large amount of outreach to get insights from them. We will be working on that. And we are also, and have continued to work on branding. Now, I'll let you know very quickly, we are on social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And throughout our days, throughout our weeks and months, we reach out on those social media sites to make sure that our parents that are there are aware. Not only that, we use our Aries email system. We make sure that sometimes they get phone calls in terms of our mass calls, but we are relying heavily on our social media options to provide information to our parents. And so we did a tremendous amount of campaigning. We sent out postcards outlining what our plans were going to be. And I guarantee you that additional flyers and postcards will be sent out once the more detailed and robust version of our distance learning plan is solidified on Monday. And this is our timeline for opening so that parents know, so the community know the steps that we took to plan and how we will roll that out to our community. So I want to thank you so much. If you have questions specifically about our district plan, please feel free to email me there at ldavs@ewcsd.org. Come to our meeting on Monday at 5 o'clock. You're always welcome as community to join us, even if you don't have children in our district. And I will tell you that we have many parents from surrounding districts who join our meeting because they want to be able to see what our district is doing and take back some of the things that they see that they like and encourage their district to do the same. So I want to thank you so much for inviting me to do this today. And I thank you so much for having the opportunity to share just a little snapshot about what we're doing in the East Peter City School District.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Debs. I really appreciate you helping us manifest our intention, which was to bring relevance and transparency and accountability to the forefront of our audiences. Certainly was well communicated in terms of all that you've shared up to the most up-to-date information. Thank you so much. We do appreciate that. In the interest of time, we're going to quickly go back to one of our features, which is the polling. And so we'll field a question there, and I will post that for you now. So please look to your screens for our first question. And the question reads, please indicate any all areas in your life that have been impacted by, and you have multiple choices, by the COVID-19 epidemic, health, work, getting a COVID test, etc. So go ahead, take a minute to designate your choice. All right, thank you. Got a couple more to respond. All right. Great, and we're going to go to our give it a few more seconds. So again, let's make our selection. All right, great. I'm going to go to the next question now. And here we are. Here's our next question for you. Using the rating scale 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how well are you adhering to recommended safety guidelines? This is again a multiple response option.
Oh, no, it's not okay. One time? No. Here, let me just fill it first.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for your responses. All right. Excellent.
Yeah.
And so with respect to that, we'll be able to aggregate the results at a later time and then be able to mention accordingly. Currently, in the interest of time, we will certainly move forward in terms of underscoring the importance of the town halls and that we join the community leaders as they share data, as we've just seen, very, very well put by our 3 speakers for today. And it affords you the opportunity to become informed of the past, understand the present, and move forward towards a formative future, and then also to serve as a change agent within your community. And certainly with the passion of our speakers, I was even moved, and my level of commitment has certainly increased in that regard as well. We do appreciate the efforts. And as we move forward in that regard, recognizing that our next town hall will address the topic of mental health and substance use, and similar to today's, we will have featured speakers to speak in terms of the components therein. That'll be set for August 6th. Please register at Eventbrite, as many of you have had previously and subsequently. And we look forward to, again, another fantastic opportunity to address some of the inequities, particularly around mental health and substance use. I want to extend a hearty thanks to all the individuals depicted here who are the Town Hall Series team and their efforts in putting everything together. Jeff Farber, Arlene Vasquez, Irene Muro, Cecilia Reyes, Alicia Vargas, Diana Zuniga, and myself. And again, it's been our pleasure hosting and facilitating this town hall. We appreciate your registration and participation. And again, a big thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you so much. And please keep in mind that if ever there's still any questions, you may email any of us in terms of the contacts that reached out to you. And thank you again. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thank you, Mrs. Dabbs. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Dr.
Cecilia.
Kotke, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I always do. I always like include and then include.